So in the last video, we talked a little bit about the other environment, right? The classroom environment is one, and then the kind of the world, but specifically the home of the students you work with, that environment. And I mentioned a little bit about discomfort and how that might inherently be a part of life in general, but specifically the possibility of interacting with parents or family, or even going to visit them in their home. And within that discussion, I mentioned letting go of thought, letting go of judgmental or critical thoughts. And when I mention that to people that I work with, say in therapy, a really common response is, well, that sounds nice. Like, but how do I do it? That's a very vague phrase, let go of thoughts. And so in this video, this self-care video, what I'd like to present is a way of practicing how to let go of thought when you choose to. So the first thing is to notice, what is thought? You know, on one hand, it's kind of like not really concrete thought. Thinking happens, we think sort of in our head, but it's not like we can capture one and put it in a jar on our shelf, right? So that's kind of interesting to think about that fact, that thoughts have so much bearing in our lives, for better or worse. But they're not really things we can grasp a hold of at all, despite how we might try. And we can't grasp them, but we also have trouble letting them go. It's kind of enigmatic. So one way to think about how to approach this sort of paradox is to notice the fact that most people, what most people report, which is that thoughts tend to show up as visual or auditory. That is, we either see our thoughts or we hear our thoughts in our mind. And it does seem to take place somewhere in the head. Whereas mental images, as visual thoughts, people tend to describe a kind of mental screen right around the eyes, or just in front of the eyes. And people tend to describe mental talk, or those auditory thoughts we hear, as actually being in the back, like around inside the ears, or in the back of the head, or in the center of the head. Or if it's our own mental voice, sometimes it feels like it's coming from our throats. This can be helpful to kind of point to thoughts, make them a little more concrete so they're a little easier to deal with. And after all, that which is trackable is tractable. That which we can detect and point to, we can actually manipulate and work with a little easier. So one other thing to consider before I suggest and actually have us practice a little bit of this sort of technique of letting go of thoughts when choosing to, is to consider the mind as being a thought-producing machine. That's its job. Our minds are built to wander and constantly obsess and think and scatter in all directions and obsess on one thing. That's how it works. That's how the mind operates. So when I suggest people work on the skill of letting go of thought, I think what people mostly think that means is to empty their thoughts, to get rid of thinking. And that's just impossible. It's a lot like seeing ripples in water and trying to flatten them out with an iron. Like, the more you try to get rid of them, the more stirred up they become. So that's a pretty important thing to, right from the outset, just acknowledge. You're not going to stop your thoughts. Treat it like, your heart is meant to beat, and it beats. Your stomach is meant to digest, and it digests. Your mind is meant to think, and it thinks. That's what's going to happen, whether you like it or not, whether you try to or not, whether you ask it to or not. And another important thing to keep in mind about thoughts, about our minds, is that they're consistently happening, just like our heart and our digestive system. Thoughts are active, whether or not we're even aware of them. Now, that seems odd, because to have a thought means to think it. That's what we mostly think, but our minds are active whether or not we are aware of that fact. And thoughts actually drive our behaviors. They influence and often bias our beliefs. They even filter our perceptions, how we see and hear and feel the world. So that's just another reason why trying to choke them off and stop thinking is really not effective or helpful to try. So let's talk a little bit about what it means to let go of thought when we choose to. Another way to phrase that is practice a way of not getting caught up, carried away, and overly identified with the activity of your mind, with thoughts that you notice coming up. So what I'd like to suggest is somewhat of a focus exercise. It's a way of practicing the skill of not getting caught up in thought. And this exercise is just like physical exercise. There's kind of like a technique or a method to do it, and upon repetition, that skill or the muscle grows and grows. So I'd like to invite you to try this somewhat simple but sometimes challenging technique with me for a few minutes right now. So whether you're sitting down or standing up, try to find a comfortable posture, one in which your spine is kind of stretched up a little bit, lengthened toward the ceiling, but one in which your muscles kind of relax around it. Think of your spine as the trunk of a tree, the muscles of your body as the limbs, twigs, and leaves that hang off of the tree. And for this practice, I'd encourage you, as I'm going to do as we practice, to close your eyes for these few minutes, if it's comfortable for you. And as you do so, direct your attention to the space right around or just in front of your closed eyes. You may at first see kind of vague colors like gray or black or a dark red, maybe playing of some shapes on the back of your eyelids. This is also the space where imagination tends to take place, right around or just in front of your closed eyes. If you were to, for instance, bring to mind a mental picture of a car that you rode to work in today, or a loved one, the face of a loved one, you might notice that you kind of see that happening right around your eyes. Now direct your attention just behind your eyes, maybe around the insides of your ears or in the center of the back of your head. This is a little subtler for most people, but if you direct your attention there, this tends to be where mental talk occurs in the mind, where we hear the thoughts that we might be thinking. If you were to, for instance, bring to mind and hear mentally one of your favorite songs, you might notice that kind of playing or ringing out toward the back of your head or in the center of your head or just inside your ears, even though there's not really any music playing outside of you. Now, do your best to just let your attention move or float wherever it happens to between these two spaces, your mental screen and that space where mental talk occurs. And begin noticing somewhat of a steady pace, every couple of seconds or so. Notice where your attention is between these two spaces. You don't have to think anything special. You don't have to notice any certain thoughts. But simply notice that at any given moment, there is one of four things happening. You're either noticing an image in the mind, or talk in the mind, some kind of sound, some kind of thought that we hear. Or you'll notice that both are happening at the same time. Or you'll notice what we might call rest, where there's a blank mental screen and your head is quiet. Now at a steady pace, to you silently to yourself, simply acknowledge which of these four things is happening, moment by moment, every couple of seconds, using the word image, talk, both, or rest, to help you keep track of which is going on. Do this on your own for a few moments, noticing image, talk, both, or rest. If you hear things happening around you, you might have a mental image of what the sound might be coming from. You could label that image because you see that in your mind. You may notice thoughts coming up about maybe feeling a little silly about what we're doing, or being confused about what we're doing, or liking what we're doing. In which case you may be hearing those thoughts, the mental voice in your head, in which case you could simply acknowledge talk. You also might notice both, or a blank and quiet mind, in which case you can notice rest. Okay, great. Good job. Now you can open your eyes. So, as I mentioned, this little exercise, it is an exercise. It's something that you do at a repetitive, steady pace to help strengthen an ability, or kind of like a mental muscle, to be able to acknowledge without getting caught up in the contents of your mind, the thoughts that might come and go. And this can be extremely helpful because it allows us to be clear about what thoughts are coming up and whether or not we get involved in them. In other words, we can observe without participating in them if we choose to. Now, that might be a kind of confusing idea, but do your best to try this out on a kind of trial basis, like just for a week or so. On a daily basis for a set period of time, just set a 5-minute timer or something. And sit down and just notice what of those 4 things are going on in my mind right now, and right now, and right now. Either image, talk, both, or rest. And I think this is important because it helps us, as I've mentioned, begin to learn what it means to let go of thought. That is, to avoid getting eaten up by them, dragged away by them, caught up in them, over-identified by them. And it gives us a sense of freedom to be able to participate in thinking, to be able to participate in the activity of our mind. But it also gives us a way not to be a prisoner to those thoughts that can sometimes be very intrusive, forceful, and overly negative. So try this on a daily basis at a kind of set time, like 5 minutes or even longer if you wish. And also try it occasionally, just peppered in throughout your day. 15 seconds here, a minute and a half here of this little focus exercise, to try to gain a different sense of clarity over the content of your own mind, and to grow a sense of freedom to allow you to step out of the flowing stream of thought without having to get rid of thought.